Hey guys, tonight we step onto an Edwardian estate lawn glowing with lanterns, where the grass has that faint, night-cool dampness that immediately slips into your shoes. You can hear the soft clatter of stagehands adjusting wooden props just out of view, and somewhere, a little too close for comfort, a man in a velvet doublet is practicing his heroic stride, which looks more like he's trying not to twist an ankle. You feel the warm lift of torch fire brushing your cheek, a reminder that you have absolutely wandered into a world pretending to be medieval, but with just enough modern nonsense mixed in that you probably won't survive this without getting roped into something mildly ridiculous. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know your location and the local time. You know I love seeing the little constellation of night owls around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move forward as the last smear of sunset dissolves behind the estate's sycamores. Lanterns hang from shepherd's hooks, trembling slightly in the breeze. They're not medieval, not even close. Edwardians adored a good theatrical flourish, but the flicker they cast across the grounds does something very particular. It makes everyone look like they're part of a painting that hasn't quite decided which century it belongs to. Ahead of you, the heart of the evening's preparations rustles and hums. A temporary medieval camp sprawls across the estate lawn, carved wooden booths, canvas pavilions dyed in jewel tones, and clusters of performers whispering their lines as though the hedges themselves might be judging their pronunciation. You pass a row of brass trumpets laid out on a table, gleaming with the unconvincing crispness of recently polished metal. A page boy, who looks suspiciously like a local teenager bribed with pastries, reaches out to touch one, gets scolded by a nearby musician, and slinks away muttering. This is Edwardian medievalism at its most enchanting and most earnest. People truly believe they were reviving the past, just, with better lighting. A footman, wearing tights with the confidence of someone determined not to let common sense prevail, directs you toward the main rehearsal area. You slip past a cluster of aristocratic guests, people who came early because they heard there might be sherry, and you catch a few fragments of their conversation. Something about the authenticity of the lute arrangements, which you're fairly sure none of them actually know anything about. The Edwardians adored engaging with history this way, gently, dramatically, and with absolutely no shame about getting details wrong. You pass a tapestry printed backdrop leaning against a folding chair, half unfurled. It shows a battle scene with horses that look like they were drawn by someone who had only read about horses in a letter describing a dream. But it's beautiful, no question. The sun-kissed embroidery threads shimmer in the lantern light. You run a finger across one golden thread, feeling the slight waxiness of the coating used to keep the fibers smooth. A nearby volunteer informs you proudly that medieval weavers probably used this method too, which is not accurate, but hey, this is not the moment to crush a man's pageant night enthusiasm. Your path brings you to the central clearing, where most of the activity converges. Here stands the estate owner, a baronet with the kind of pointed beard that screams both distinguished and please validate my historical knowledge. He's addressing a semicircle of participants who hold torches like they're preparing for a slow-motion duel. Remember, he says in a theatrical baritone, we want to evoke noble simplicity, not chaos. Watching everyone nod solemnly, you're struck by how chaotic this noble simplicity already is. Someone's cloak is on fire, only a little, and three knights are arguing about whether a medieval shield should be held parallel or perpendicular to the body. Historians still argue whether medieval shields were standardized at all, but you're not about to inject that nuance into this very flammable situation. You slip closer to the cluster of performers practicing their entrances. They move in carefully choreographed pairs, stepping onto the lawn in slow, sweeping rhythms. It looks a bit like a medieval procession translated through Edwardian ballroom etiquette. One woman in a crown of papier-mâché roses keeps missing her mark and whispering, "Sorry." "Sorry," in the most apologetic, queenly voice imaginable. A man in chainmail, real chainmail, astonishingly, sits on a bench and fans himself dramatically. "Never again," he mutters. "This is heavier than my first marriage." You chuckle under your breath because he's clearly tired but also clearly delighted to be suffering for the cause of historical whimsy. As you wander, the sensory world thickens. Warm wax from the torches, fresh cut grass, and the faint sweetness of someone passing around early evening tea biscuits. A violinist gives a tentative scrape of tuning, followed by the low hum of a rehearsal drone meant to mimic medieval instruments. Fun historical fact: while trumpets and shawms did exist in the Middle Ages, Edwardians often romanticized them into sounding like something from a fairy court. So what you hear now is less authentic medieval and more the soundtrack they wish the Middle Ages had. Near the estate's terrace, a group of townspeople hired as extras sit on hay bales gossiping. One of them tells the others that a real medieval fair smelled like mud, sweat, and questionable stew. Another claims, incorrectly but confidently, that people used dried lavender as currency back then. You store that one in your mental drawer labeled Fringe Historical Tidbits, because truly, who comes up with this stuff? You drift down a lantern-lit path curving toward the edge of the grounds. From here, you can see how the estate has been transformed. The faux timber stalls, the colorful banners fluttering overhead, the gleam of brass torches placed at precise intervals. Everything feels intentionally curated to transport you, but also blatantly theatrical once you look too long. Still, the charm is undeniable. Edwardians staged medieval pageantry not to recreate history faithfully, but to capture the emotional outline of it, the music, the gestures, the soft glow of imagined nobility. They loved the dream of the Middle Ages, the version made of romance and spectacle rather than mud and mortality. You pause beside a small reflecting pool. Lanterns dance across the water's surface, breaking and reforming in soft gold ripples. A pair of performers in monk costumes rehearse their silent entrance nearby, whispering their lines backstage even though they aren't supposed to speak at all. One asks the other whether real monks shave their heads completely or just partially. The other shrugs and says, "Historians still argue whether tonsure styles meant anything symbolic." You smile. For once, the scholarly debate moment came pre-packaged, like a little gift. A soft bell rings from across the lawn. Not medieval, a bicycle bell actually, but it signals the same thing. Evening rehearsals are shifting into final coordination. Lanterns flare brighter as volunteers refill the oil. The sky above deepens into indigo, and a few early stars appear, twinkling like the estate ordered extra twinkle just for effect. And you, standing there in the glowing half-dark, realize something. This whole place is an intersection of fantasy and fact, of Edwardian elegance and medieval imagination. You're not just a spectator. You're drifting into the living heartbeat of people trying to recreate a world that never existed exactly as they believed. But the passion, oh, that part is absolutely real. You follow the glow of lanterns toward a long outbuilding made of brick and optimism, the estate's makeshift costume hall. Inside, the air is thick with the warm scent of pressed wool, perfumed soap flakes, and that faint tang of steam rising from overworked irons. If you've ever opened an attic trunk full of old clothes and felt like the garments themselves exhaled, that's the exact sensation waiting for you as you push aside a heavy curtain and step in. The place is alive. Not in the supernatural sense. Edwardians weren't summoning ghosts tonight, at least not officially, but in the way bolts of cloth rustle as if they're trying to crawl off the tables and become costumes themselves. Tailors dart between mannequins like caffeinated sparrows. A woman with pincushions strapped to both wrists gestures you out of the walkway before you get impaled by a runaway embroidery needle. Everywhere you turn, there's fabric. Damask, velvet, coarse homespun, linen stiff with starch, even some shimmering synthetic silk the costume mistress insists is close enough to medieval if no one breathes near it. What strikes you first is the color. Saturated jewel tones so vivid they practically hum. Deep crimson gowns hang beside peacock blue tunics. A forest green cloak embroidered with silver thread flares across a padded stool like a miniature landscape. Edwardians adored rich color in their pageantry. It made the medieval past feel more alive, more theatrical, more flattering under gaslight. Historically accurate, someone asks aloud. Not always, but aesthetically irresistible, absolutely. You slip between racks and accidentally brush against a sleeve lined with what feels like rabbit fur. The tailoress beside you leans in and whispers, "Don't worry, dear, it's fake." She says this with the tone of someone who once dressed an entire cast in real fox pelts and regretted it deeply. You murmur something supportive, hoping it sounds historically literate. At the back of the hall, a long table serves as both a sewing station and the emotional support center for costumed chaos. Two tailors argue over the hem of a tunic that's supposed to look authentically medieval but also flattering. A contradictory brief that has led to more sleepless nights than the invention of elastic. One insists medieval sleeves should drape like curtains. The other prefers something more knightly, darling, less laundry day chic. Neither is wrong, though historians still argue whether the exaggerated sleeve lengths of certain medieval gowns were symbolic, fashionable, or simply a hazard to everyday tasks like not setting yourself on fire. From behind you, a thump echoes, followed by an exasperated groan. You turn to find a heap of shimmering brocades heaving slightly. It takes a moment to realize a man has collapsed under the weight of his half-fitted costume. His head pokes out from the pile, cheeks flushed. "My kingdom," he wheezes, "for a lighter cloak." A tailor rushes over, laughing breathlessly as she frees him piece by piece. You help untangle a golden cord from his shoulder and try not to giggle when he stands up and bows like this was all very intentional. In the corner, an apprentice sits cross-legged on the floor, meticulously sewing tiny imitation pearls onto a headdress. She hums a tune you don't recognize, soft, lilting, almost hymn-like. "It's from a medieval manuscript," she tells you proudly, though after a beat she amends, "Well, a modern arrangement of a medieval manuscript. In the spirit of things." This is very Edwardian, confident enthusiasm paired with a light sprinkling of historical ambiguity. You wander deeper, following the rhythmic whip-whip of shears slicing fabric. A senior costumer, a man with silver hair tied back ribbon style, unfurls a tapestry-patterned material across a table. "Imported from France," he says, rolling his RS dramatically, "inspired by the Lady and the Unicorn series. Though don't look too closely, this unicorn seems to have the posture of an irritated goat." You bend to look. The creature does indeed appear disgruntled, but charmingly so, as if it refused to be replicated without voicing some artistic protest. Nearby, performers drift in and out for fittings. A young woman trying on a burgundy gown lifts her arms, and the sleeves float outward like sails preparing for wind. She beams at her reflection in a tall mirror, cheeks flushed, then whispers to you conspiratorially, "They say real medieval dresses weighed as much as a toddler." You aren't sure that's true, but she delivers the line with such glee you don't dare challenge it. And honestly, a good pageant thrives on enthusiasm more than accuracy. You step into the fitting room area, really just a row of screens draped with cloth, and catch the tail end of a heated debate, two actors quarreling over whether their characters should wear capes indoors. "It's England," one argues. "Drafts everywhere. the other counters, but capes indoors are impractical. A tailor chimes in with the sort of exhausted diplomacy practiced by kindergarten teachers. Let's compromise. One of you wears it on, the other carries it dramatically. They agree instantly. Crisis averted. There's a beautiful chaos to the place. At one station, a tailor uses a candle wick to seal frayed thread ends, a practice they believe medieval seamstresses might have used, though evidence is vague at best. Still, the scent of singed fibers mingles with the warm air, and you appreciate the commitment. At another station, a worker carefully rubs soot onto the edge of a cloak to give it that travel-worn look, only to wipe it off and start over when the result seems more chimney-sweep than noble wanderer. You pass a small open trunk overflowing with accessories, leather belts, wooden rosaries, brass buckles, and one strangely modern-looking pocket watch someone must have lost. You hand it to a stagehand, who shrugs and pockets it. Everything ends up in the costumes eventually, he says. If it's shiny, it'll be worn by someone. A perfect summary of Edwardian medieval pageantry. Then comes the best moment, the reveal of the night's central costume. The costume mistress waves you over with a grand gesture usually reserved for presenting newborn royalty. She pulls back a velvet cloth to unveil a gown meant for the pageant's queen. It's breathtaking, silver embroidery swirling like moonlit vines across deep sapphire velvet. Tiny faceted glass gems sparkle at the neckline, catching lantern light in 1,000 miniature flashes. This, she announces, placing one hand reverently on the fabric, is Fantasia Medii, medieval fantasy as it ought to have been. It's not technically accurate, but it is undeniably magnificent. You let your fingers drift across the fabric, noticing how cool and dense the velvet feels, how smooth the embroidery is beneath your touch. She leans in. The real Middle Ages were muddier, she whispers. But why should mud have all the fun? A burst of laughter erupts near the doorway as someone tries on a suit of faux armor made entirely from tinplate, light, shiny, and loud enough to announce its wearer 3 counties away. He takes one step and sounds like someone dropped a drawer full of saucepans. The whole costume hall pauses, then collectively applauds the acoustic spectacle. One tailor sighs contentedly. Perfect, she says. Just the right amount of impractical. You linger a little longer, letting the soft thunder of sewing machines, murmured instructions, and rustling cloth wash over you. Here, in this warm, bustling hive of creativity, you begin to understand something essential. The Edwardians weren't just reviving medieval pageantry. They were reimagining it, stitching the past and the present together with enthusiasm, artistry, and a flair for the theatrical. And as you step back toward the lantern-lit path outside, your senses full of silk and wool and tinplate clatter, you realize you're starting to believe in this medieval dream they're building, just enough to carry you into whatever comes next. You wake to the sound of trumpets, plural, loud, and absolutely unrepentant about it. The kind of brassy morning fanfare that doesn't so much greet the dawn as assault it. You sit up on your narrow cot in the guest quarters, blinking at the pale Edwardian sunlight leaking through lace curtains, wondering for a brief, delirious moment if you've accidentally enlisted in some medieval militia. The fanfare blares again, wobbling at the high notes like the trumpeters are either extremely enthusiastic or extremely uncaffeinated. You stretch, groan, and accept your fate. Today is rehearsal day, and the estate's musicians are warming up with the subtlety of an airship engine. You step outside, pulling your cloak, or more accurately, the cloak someone in the costume hall shoved at you tighter around your shoulders. The grass is cold beneath your boots, still jeweled with dew. The morning air is fresh in that almost aggressive countryside way, like it's daring you not to wake up properly. Up ahead on a wooden platform overlooking the lawn, the musicians are assembled like a mismatched royal orchestra. Trumpets, shawms, viols, a drum the size of a small whale, and something that looks like a lute but has more pegs than sense. The trumpet section is the loudest. Obviously. One of them blows a triumphant flourish, cracks the last note, and mutters a curse that is definitely not medieval but extremely relatable. You approach the platform just as the conductor, an energetic woman in a burgundy waistcoat, claps her hands. All right, again. But this time imagine you're announcing the arrival of a noble procession, not trying to scare off geese. The trumpeters straighten their posture. One adjusts his feathered cap, clearly wishing he had slept 20 minutes longer. They lift their instruments, inhale together, and unleash another blast. Better. Still loud enough to rattle your teeth, but now it has rhythm, purpose, something almost ancient in its swagger. One of the violinists, yes, violinists, Edwardians had absolutely no intention of limiting themselves to period-accurate instruments, gives you a sleepy wave. He sidles over between takes and whispers conspiratorially. Did you know medieval trumpets didn't have valves, just long metal tubes? Beautifully simple, terribly limiting. He gestures toward the modern trumpets with a flourish. These, cheating, lovely cheating, you nod impressed. A real historical fact before you've even had breakfast. The conductor calls for a run-through of the pageant's opening march. The drummers begin with a steady thump-thump, deep and resonant like a heartbeat echoing through wooden caverns. The shawms join in, their reedy voices climbing the air in spirals that somehow sound both celebratory and slightly haunted. You can't help but grin. It's enchanting, chaotic, yes, with a few squeaky notes, but enchanting nonetheless. This kind of musical interpretation was very Edwardian, not wholly accurate, not completely invented, just optimistically medieval. You wander closer to the edge of the platform, where a young assistant hovers over sheet music clipped to the conductor's stand. She notices you looking and sighs dramatically. They want the music to evoke the spirit of the 15th century, she whispers, tapping the score, but with enough modern phrasing that the audience doesn't get confused. You glance at the notes. The piece looks part medieval march, part Victorian parlor number. Is that on purpose? You ask. She shrugs. Historians still argue whether medieval music ever sounded like this, but the baronet insists it's heroic. You mentally file that under scholarly debate of the day. Meanwhile, one trumpeter has wandered off to practice alone. He stands near the fountain, facing the sunrise like he's about to challenge it to a duel. He raises his trumpet, blows one piercing note, and startles a pair of pigeons into frantic flight. Victory, he proclaims to no one in particular. You chuckle. The Edwardians loved theatrics. You've noticed this. A gong rings from across the lawn, signaling a full cast rehearsal. Performers in partial costume shuffle out, cloaks thrown over their nightshirts, laces untied, crowns askew. They gather near the musicians, trying to look majestic despite clear evidence of insufficient sleep. One man wearing half a knight's armor yawns so widely his visor pops open. A woman in a velvet gown tries to warm her hands over a torch. Two children cast as medieval villagers pick at the pastries they've smuggled from the kitchen, scattering crumbs on their burlap tunics. The musicians begin the opening march again, louder, smoother, and more confident now that they've scared the wildlife and woken the estate. Performers attempt to step in time, though many seem confused about the proper pace. Slower, calls the conductor. Then the music needs to slow, calls the baronet from the terrace. The conductor glares up at him. The music is slow, walk like people who own their legs. You admire her patience. You continue drifting through the rehearsal area, absorbing the sensory feast around you. Someone is shaking a tambourine with great sincerity. Someone else is tuning a viol that insists it is not in the mood for cooperation. A drummer tests different beats on the whale-sized drum, each thump vibrating through your ribs. You swear your heartbeat briefly syncs with it. A fringe fact pops into your mind, something a two eager footmen mentioned last night, that medieval trumpeters supposedly used trumpet blasts as coded communication in battle. True. Kind of. Exaggerated. Definitely. but it's exactly the sort of embellished tidbit Edwardians adored. So now every time a trumpeter flubs a note, you imagine an entire imaginary medieval army receiving the wrong battlefield instructions and marching straight into a hedge. A boy assigned as a page runs past you carrying a stack of music sheets that immediately scatter in the wind like academic confetti. You help him chase them down, stepping carefully through puddles of dew. He sighs dramatically when you hand the stack back. "I'm supposed to hold the Queen's banner later," he says, "but if it's windy, I'll probably fly away with it." "An honorable sacrifice," you reply. He snorts. "My mum says the same." Back on the platform, the conductor tries something new. "Let's attempt the invocation of the court," quietly this time. The musicians nod. The trumpets do not nod. What follows is a surprisingly gentle, flowing piece, with lilting melodies drifting soft as breath. You feel your shoulders loosen, your pulse steadying. The music wraps around you like warm fog. It's peaceful, serene, even until someone coughs loudly from the performer's line, startling a trumpeter into blasting a sharp note that completely shatters the mood. The conductor turns, lips pressed tightly. The trumpeter lifts one finger. "Artistic choice." "Absolutely not," she replies. Rehearsal breaks for a moment while adjustments are made. A cluster of musicians argues about ornamentation. A violinist insists the piece needs a flourish. A flutist counters that medieval flutes didn't do flourish-y things. A trumpeter chimes in. "Mine does." Their debate dissolves into laughter, and you catch a phrase from one of the older musicians. "If the Middle Ages didn't sound like this, they should have." That's the Edwardian pageant philosophy in a nutshell. Someone hands you a cup of warm milk tea, sweet, comforting, edged with the faint smokiness of the outdoor kettle. You sip it slowly, watching the wind nudge banners into lazy ripples. Sunlight climbs higher, turning the brass instruments into glowing slivers of fire. The whole scene feels dreamlike. A modern orchestra pretending to be medieval, performers pretending to be nobles, and you pretending you're not already deeply invested in the outcome of this pageant. As the musicians resume, the morning transforms into a tapestry of sound. You feel it in your bones, in the soles of your boots, in the soft hum resonating through the estate grounds. And somewhere inside you, that hum becomes anticipation, because this music is more than rehearsal. It's the heartbeat of the pageant, the pulse that will carry you into the next layer of this Edwardian medieval dream. You trail behind him, this wiry, over-caffeinated figure in a tweed waistcoat who moves with the frantic elegance of someone juggling 12 imaginary swords. The pageant master. The man whose quill, quite literally, scripts the medieval fantasies the Edwardians are so desperate to believe in. He strides across the rehearsal field with long, bird-like steps, ink stains blooming on his cuffs like badges of honor. You try to keep up, though it feels a bit like trying to chase a caffeinated fox through a maze built of velvet drapes and papier-mâché castle walls. He clutches a leather folio to his chest, stuffed with handwritten pages, real parchment for dramatic effect, but you can smell the fresh ink and the faint tang of a fountain pen he pretends not to use. "Authenticity," he mutters, "is an act of faith," which is a poetic way of admitting he's making up half the details and hoping no one in the audience has read an actual medieval manuscript since 1372. You peer over his shoulder as he stops abruptly near a half-assembled wooden battlement. One sheet slips from his folio, fluttering to the ground like a wounded dove. You scoop it up. The page is covered in looping script, full of grand declarations. Sir Aldrich, with valor unyielding, confronts the enchanted boar of Whitmere Wood. You blink. "Enchanted boar," you echo. He snatches the sheet back with a flourish. "Based very loosely on a real Anglo-Saxon myth," he insists, though historians still argue whether the myth even existed or whether it was invented by a Victorian antiquarian with too much free time and a fondness for strong beer. His quill, An actual goose feather dipped into a little brass-topped inkwell he keeps on a chain, swishes with quick, confident strokes as he jots notes mid-stride. Needs more chivalric sparkle, he murmurs, scribbling. And fewer lawsuits. That part makes you slow down. You didn't realize medieval pageantry came with legal risk, but apparently, last year an enthusiastic squire swung a prop mace too enthusiastically and introduced a member of the mayor's committee to the concept of mild concussion. The pageant master blamed an excess of historical realism, which somehow convinced everyone to let him keep his job. You follow as he pivots toward a pair of actors awkwardly rehearsing a mystical forest encounter, though they're standing in front of a painted backdrop still drying at the edges. One actor is dressed as a wizard, his robe spangled with stars that definitely come from a department store's Christmas clearance bin. The other plays a wandering knight who brandishes a foam sword with such conviction that you worry he actually believes it's forged from enchanted steel. Your stance. The pageant master cries, gesturing wildly. Broaden your stance. This is chivalry, not a tea party. The wizard adjusts his posture. The knight looks offended, as though tea parties are a legitimate battlefield in his personal code of honor. You can feel the master's energy vibrating through the air like static. He launches into an impromptu demonstration, sweeping an imaginary cape behind himself. You must move as though destiny itself is tugging your elbows, he commands. You're impressed and mildly concerned he hasn't slept since Tuesday. The rumor among the volunteers is that he survives exclusively on black tea, peppermint humbugs, and the adrenaline of impending deadlines. You notice something delightful on the corner of one script page, a doodle of a dragon wearing pince-nez spectacles. That one won't make it into the final performance, he admits sheepishly when he sees you looking. Not because it's inaccurate, dragons are always accurate in popular imagination, but because the costume budget is a war crime. He sighs theatrically. One day I'll stage a full draconic procession. One day. He stops at another rehearsal cluster, a trio of peasants practicing how to look convincingly downtrodden. Their costumes are artfully dirtied with fireplace soot and yesterday's coffee grounds. One woman raises her hand timidly. Master, should peasants bow or curtsy when the faux king passes? Without looking up from his notes, he replies, neither. You just sort of recoil slightly. That's historically ambiguous enough to be safe. Historically ambiguous. You file that away as the unofficial motto of Edwardian medievalism. As he strides on, you spot a particularly questionable line in the script tucked under his arm. The High Druid then summons forth the spirit of wireless communication. You stop him with a raised eyebrow. He clears his throat. Look, wireless is modern, yes, but people don't know what druids actually did. Hardly anyone does, so creative license. At this point, you're convinced the man is powered entirely by creative license. Still, beneath the jittery enthusiasm, you sense something earnest. He pauses beside a large tapestry depicting heroic knights rescuing maidens from improbable beasts. His expression softens. People need stories, he says quietly. Especially now. They need to believe the past was noble. That someone somewhere once fought dragons so we wouldn't have to. His voice dips into that gentle, slightly frayed tone that makes you imagine he's carrying more than ink-stained folios on his shoulders. He admits, only after glancing around to ensure no committee members are nearby, that much of the script is stitched together from medieval romances, early folklore, and whatever scraps of poetic nonsense he dreams up at 3 a.m. when the oil lamp starts to flicker. But the heart of it, he insists, is true. The Edwardians adored pageantry because it reminded them of hope, of romance, of something more magical than the persistent smell of coal smoke. He waves his quill like a conductor's baton. You can almost hear an invisible orchestra tuning as he orchestrates the chaos around him. Knights practicing synchronized kneeling, squires attempting to look heroic despite their helmets slipping sideways, maidens trying to remember if their choreography involves swooning left or swooning right. A young apprentice trots up with a question about whether a medieval courier would say greetings or salutations, and the master instantly replies, yes, which somehow satisfies everyone involved. But the anachronisms, the little historical hiccups, are everywhere. One knight's shield displays a coat of arms invented in 1897. A minstrel tunes a mandolin that wouldn't exist for several centuries. And the master's script features a scene where monks debate the mystical properties of tea, even though tea won't enter English culture until much, much later. You try to point this out gently. He waves you off. No one ever complains when Shakespeare plays fast and loose with history, he says. Besides, accuracy is relative. Entertainment is eternal. A gust of wind tries to steal his script pages again. You help him catch them, your hands brushing ink-sticky parchment. He beams at you, delighted to have a co-conspirator. You see, he says, this is the joy creating a world that never was, yet somehow feels more real than the one we're standing in. You stay with him until the sun begins to dip, casting warm amber light over the bustling rehearsal grounds. The master surveys everything, the castle facade, the actors, the props, with a proud, slightly manic air. He presses the tip of his quill to his chin. We're nearly there, he whispers. Just a touch more magic. As you walk away, you can still hear him behind you, barking instructions, rewriting lines mid-sentence, and humming a triumphal march he hopes the brass band can learn before opening night. You realize then that this entire pageant, its dreams, its illusions, its charming inaccuracies, flows straight from that ink-stained quill, and the frantic imagination of one man determined to resurrect the Middle Ages, even if he has to invent half of it from scratch. You drift from the pageant master's orbit, where quills fly like startled birds, and slip toward the corner of the rehearsal grounds where the real machinery of medieval make-believe clatters, creaks, and occasionally explodes in little puffs of sawdust. The prop workshops, the heart of the illusion. You hear them before you see them. The metallic clinks of tools, the uneven hum of hand-cranked drills, and the sing-song chatter of volunteers who have no formal training but endless enthusiasm. The first thing that hits you is the smell. Freshly cut wood, drying paint, wool, glue, and something that might be roasting chestnuts, though you suspect it's actually someone's forgotten lunch accidentally baking on a forge plate. You push through a canvas flap and step into an environment that looks like a medieval guild hall collided with a hardware store, and decided to work things out diplomatically. A carpenter with a walrus mustache nods at you as he sands down the edge of a shield blank. The grain of the wood glows warmly under his hands. The shape is authentic enough, but the stencil beside him reads property of St. Albert's BOYS, school return after pageant, which slightly undermines the illusion. He catches your glance. Budget, he grunts. But the Edwardians recycled everything. Sustainability before it was trendy. You smile because that odd historical tidbit might actually be true. Some social historians still argue whether Edwardian pageants were proto-environmentalist out of necessity or philosophy. Across the room, a young woman in a paint-splattered apron is meticulously distressing a tapestry. She dabs the surface with a sponge dipped in diluted tea, muttering, "Too new, too clean, too smug-looking." She glances up at you and lifts the corner for inspection. The textile depicts a grand hunt scene inspired by medieval originals, though she admits the hounds are modeled on her neighbor's terrier because it had a nice medieval energy. You're not entirely certain what that means, but the dog does look convincingly heroic. Behind her, two men wrestle with a massive wooden structure that will become a castle gate. Wrestle being generous, it's more like the gate is winning. One man calls out, "Lift on 3." And then immediately lifts on 2, sending his partner stumbling backward into a pile of faux boulders made of stuffed burlap. You rush forward instinctively, but everyone laughs it off. Apparently, Edwardian prop making is 30% craftsmanship, 30% improvisation, and 40% controlled falling. At a cluttered table, an elderly volunteer carefully assembles a magical artifact, a glowing orb mounted on a gilded stand. You lean closer. The orb is a repurposed gas lamp globe with swirling designs etched by hand, and inside it, a tiny electric bulb wired to a discreet foot pedal. The crowd will think it's alchemy, he whispers conspiratorially. But it's actually the work of my nephew, who's very good with electric fuses and slightly less good with fire safety. You decide not to ask follow-up questions about the second part. A hammer clangs loudly behind you, making you jump. Someone in chainmail laughs and says, "Don't worry, it's tin. Real chainmail is heavy enough to make you walk like a depressed tortoise." He hands you a strip of the faux mail, its interlocking rings gleaming convincingly under the workshop lamps. It's surprisingly light. "Real armor," he continues, "could weigh over 50 pounds. Imagine fighting in that. Imagine climbing stairs in that. No wonder medieval knights had thighs like tree trunks." That's your mainstream historical fact for the evening, delivered with genuine admiration. As you explore deeper, you discover a corner dedicated to hazard management, which sounds more official than it looks. A chalkboard lists notes: no open flames in the Dragon Cave. Replace foam lance tips. Do not let the mayor ride the mechanical horse again. You stop at the last one and raise a brow. A costume seamstress sighs dramatically. Last year he wanted to enter the field like a true monarch. Nearly took out half the brass band. She goes back to sewing a king's robe with gold thread so shiny it practically hums. Nearby, a young apprentice is carving intricate runes into a ceremonial staff. The design is mesmerizing, the tiny spirals and geometric knots flowing together like a spell in wood. "Are the runes accurate?" you ask gently. He beams. "Totally. Well, mostly. I copied them from a Victorian book of Norse myths, but historians now think some of those symbols were made up by a poet with strong opinions." You nod knowingly. Historians still argue whether that poet invented half the rune system or just embellished it to impress dinner guests. One table is covered entirely in helmets, rows and rows of them, each crowned with feathers, plumes, or decorative antlers. The antlers catch your attention. "Are those real?" you ask. The prop master looks at you deadpan. "Do you want them to be?" You decide that is the correct number of nightmares for the day and move on. The workshop bustles with a sort of chaotic harmony. Every station contributes something essential: shields that will gleam under torchlight, banners that will ripple dramatically in the evening breeze, wooden swords polished to look like steel, and armor plates carefully embossed with motifs inspired by manuscripts the pageant master swears are historically accurate, but you know how that usually goes by now. Yet, for all the anachronisms and improvisations, you can feel the devotion in every brushstroke, every seam, every hammered nail. The Edwardians weren't simply copying the medieval world. They were building their own version, rosier, mythic, hopeful. A world where every tapestry thread tells a story, every prop carries its own heartbeat, and every piece of crafted illusion invites you to believe, just for a moment, in a past that never quite existed. As you watch a trio of volunteers fit together the final hinge of the castle gate, something warm settles over you. It's the sense that this workshop isn't merely constructing scenery. They're building dreams. And in this bustling, paint-spattered sanctuary, the line between history and imagination becomes beautifully, wonderfully blurred. The sun dips lower now, and the shadows stretching across the estate lawn begin to look like the very phantoms of history the Edwardians are trying to summon. You wander past the workshops and toward the practice arena, where actors, musicians, and costumed volunteers collide in a slow, carefully orchestrated chaos. The air hums with anticipation, the faint tang of candle wax mingling with the crisp evening breeze, and somewhere nearby, a trumpet squeaks an uncertain note. You pause to watch, letting the scene wash over you. A young actor, still in half-draped armor, practices a bow that looks suspiciously like a modern curtsy. He adjusts his helmet, glances around, and mutters, "I hope the baronet doesn't notice." You smile. The baronet will notice, but you've learned that the charm of Edwardian pageantry lies in these small, joyful missteps. It's the perfect blend of earnest effort and theatrical license. Historians still argue whether these performances were intended as educational demonstrations or pure entertainment, and standing here, you realize it doesn't matter. Both are true. Near the center of the arena, a miniature stage has been erected for the evening's pageant scenes. It's constructed from wooden panels painted to resemble stone and timber, the kind of clever illusion that invites disbelief in the most delightful way. Behind it, a pair of stagehands fuss over props, a painted dragon head, a tiny chest overflowing with glittering faux jewels, and an enormous scroll inscribed with elegant calligraphy. The scroll lists the acts, but it's clearly flexible. Plans will shift according to weather, performer energy, and last-minute creative impulses. A group of noble ladies glides across the lawn, their skirts swishing rhythmically, carrying baskets of flowers. They've clearly practiced this movement many times, yet each step is slightly different, giving the procession an organic, almost living quality. One of them winks at you, as if acknowledging that you, too, are part of the spectacle now. You notice the delicate embroidery on her sleeves, hand-stitched by volunteers who spent hours translating medieval motifs into something achievable with modern needles and thread. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, even if some patterns are historically imaginative. To your left, a cluster of knights rehearses choreographed swordplay. Their wooden weapons clang with exaggerated authority. One knight trips over the hem of his surcoat, flailing dramatically before righting himself with an exaggerated flourish. Laughter ripples through the rehearsal area, but the pageant master is nearby, taking notes furiously on a small parchment. He murmurs to himself about timing, spectacle, and audience engagement, tweaking dialogue and stage directions on the fly. His quill dances like an orchestra conductor's baton, translating chaos into narrative. A minstrel takes position at the edge of the arena, tuning a harp and a small lute simultaneously. She plucks tentative notes that echo softly across the lawn, blending seamlessly with the gentle rustle of banners in the evening breeze. Edwardians adored musical accompaniment in pageantry, not for authenticity alone, but because music created emotional resonance. The melodies you hear are carefully arranged to feel medieval, though the instrumentation occasionally betrays its Edwardian roots. You catch a fragment of a tune, sweet and lilting, and wonder how many audience members will recognize the subtle modern flourishes. Nearby, a child dressed as a page runs back and forth, delivering messages between knights and noble ladies. His small leather belt is adorned with faux gold buckles, and his cap is slightly too large, sliding over one eye comically. You can't help but chuckle as he salutes with the seriousness of a seasoned performer, delivering his lines with wide-eyed sincerity. These young participants bring an infectious energy that reminds you that pageantry is as much about involvement as presentation. The backdrop behind the main stage glows with tapestry like murals depicting heroic quests, dragon battles, and idyllic castles. A few banners hang from the terrace above, painted in bold colors and embroidered with heraldic symbols. You notice one particularly charming anachronism, a unicorn wearing a crown and carrying a shield. No medieval manuscript ever depicted such a creature, but it embodies the Edwardian fascination with whimsy, imagination, and the romanticized past. That, perhaps more than strict historical accuracy, defines the experience of these pageants. The pageant master paces at the edge of the arena, issuing gentle commands and sporadic encouragement. He adjusts the timing of the actors, the positioning of props, and the pacing of the music. His voice rises and falls like a conductor, blending authority with a warm, almost paternal amusement. Occasionally, he scribbles furiously on a small scrap of paper, then tears it off and hands it to an actor. "Add more gravitas here," it reads. The actors nod solemnly, understanding that gravitas is as much a mindset as a physical posture. You drift closer to one of the side entrances, where a wizard in a deep violet robe adjusts the brim of his hat. He glances at a small, glowing orb mounted on a pedestal, practicing incantations under his breath. The effect is dramatic. A flickering light dances across his face, casting shifting shadows that give him an air of mysticism. You note that the orb is powered by a small electric candle hidden cleverly behind a velvet drape. Edwardians were fascinated by the illusion of magic. They understood the audience's willingness to suspend disbelief and leaned into it fully. As twilight settles over the estate, the lanterns along the pathways are lit. The warm, golden glow illuminates the faces of performers and spectators alike. Shadows lengthen across the lawn, emphasizing the grandeur of the costumes, the shimmer of the tapestries, and the meticulous craftsmanship of the props. The pageant's atmosphere is now fully immersive. You can almost forget the 20th century entirely, lost in this Edwardian dream of the Middle Ages. Somewhere in the distance, a trumpet signals the rehearsal's final act, and the ensemble moves into formation. Knights, nobles, pages, and musicians converge, their choreography blending centuries of imagination into a single sweeping tableau. You step back and watch, feeling the pulse of anticipation, the slow buildup of narrative, and the careful layering of spectacle. In this moment, the Edwardian pageant is more than historical reenactment. It's an art form, a celebration of collective creativity, and a portal into a romanticized past. The evening deepens, and you wander toward the textile workshop again, drawn by the subtle glow of lamplight and the faint aroma of beeswax polish mingling with wool. Here, you watch artisans pin banners and tapestries to long, slender rods. Each fabric tells its own story: dragons curling around knights, heraldic shields, floral motifs that would have looked at home in a cathedral illumination. Some of the motifs are copied from actual medieval designs, others born purely of Edwardian imagination. The effect is seamless, the eye fills in gaps, and the mind is tricked into believing history is far more orderly than it ever was. A seamstress leans over a half-finished gown, threading tiny beads along the neckline. She hums a tune you vaguely recognize, probably a Victorian lullaby repurposed for her work. "Beads make it sparkle from the audience," she explains, "and sparkle is timeless." You watch her hands move with a practiced grace, looping thread through the fabric with a rhythm that's part meditation, part performance. Historians still argue whether medieval embroidery was as ornate as pageants suggest, but the gleam of these beads convinces you it was, at least in spirit. Across the room, a young volunteer carefully pins golden trims onto velvet surcoats for the knights. One misjudges the spacing, and the other leans over with mock indignation. "If Sir Geoffrey saw this, he'd call it sacrilege." The first giggles, then steps back to admire the pattern with the solemnity of a gallery curator. You realize that, in Edwardian pageantry, humor and reverence coexist in perfect tension. The performers and craftsmen don't merely recreate the past, they inhabit it, improvise within it, and add their own flourishes without guilt. You pass a table stacked with miniature heraldic shields, each labeled meticulously: Knight of the Swan, Lord of Whitmere, Baron of Brightwater. The craftsmanship is exquisite, with tiny enameled crests and hand-painted flourishes. One shield bears a slight mistake: a lion with 3 legs instead of 4. A young boy notices immediately and leans over to ask if it's intentional. The prop master shrugs. Artistic license. The lion still roars. Nearby, a man polishes a suit of tinplate armor until it gleams. You lift a helmet to examine it, and it's surprisingly lightweight. Real armor could weigh a soldier down for a full day of fighting, he says, flexing his arms dramatically. Try fencing in one, and you'll appreciate padded linen more than gold. You nod, mentally noting that the Edwardians valued spectacle over battlefield practicality, yet maintained a playful nod to historical realism. In a quiet corner, a stack of scripts catches your eye. They are handwritten in elaborate calligraphy, each page carefully decorated with marginalia, doodled dragons, ornamental flourishes, and playful notes to performers. One reads, "Remember the squirrel. He distracts the king in scene 3. You blink. The squirrel." The pageant master had mentioned it earlier, an improvisational mascot inserted to delight audiences. It's charming, slightly absurd, and quintessentially Edwardian. A small group rehearses gestures for the evening performance. The knights raise swords, the ladies bow, pages curtsy or recoil appropriately. The movements are stylized, exaggerated for visibility, but grounded in a careful observation of historical manuals, albeit interpreted through Edwardian eyes. A whispered correction floats through the room. More flourish. Remember, the audience is half a mile away in spirit. You smile at the reminder that Edwardian pageantry is designed to captivate, not to replicate with rigid fidelity. Suddenly, a flurry of activity erupts near the tapestry wall. Someone has knocked over a crate of prop gemstones, sending them scattering across the floor like a spilled rainbow. Volunteers laugh as they bend to gather the tiny treasures, their hands brushing against silk, velvet, and painted wooden swords. The effect is chaotic, yet joyful, exactly the kind of human imperfection that makes the pageant feel alive. The sun finally sinks below the horizon, and lanterns strung along the estate glow warmly. Shadows play across tapestries and costumes, lending the grounds a dreamlike quality. You walk through this luminous maze, noticing every shimmering detail. Embroidered flowers catching the last light, polished armor glinting, banners swaying gently in the breeze. The Edwardians have transformed reality into fantasy, history into theater, and the ordinary into something magical. You pause for a moment, letting it all sink in: the clinking armor, the hum of whispered instructions, the meticulous care in every stitch and brushstroke. This is more than a pageant. It's a collective dream, an elaborate conversation with the past where imagination leads the way. And standing there, amid all this orchestrated beauty, you feel a strange sense of calm, as if the Edwardians' love of pageantry has cast a spell not just on history, but on you. The evening settles into a soft hush, and you drift toward the open-air rehearsal space where the full cast begins coordinating their movements under the gentle glow of lanterns. The baronet himself lingers on a raised terrace, inspecting every detail with the kind of intensity that makes you wonder whether he was born to direct pageants or to worry about them. You watch as the pageant master scribbles last-minute notes on a scrap of parchment, his quill darting like a hummingbird. The performers adjust, shift, and glance at one another nervously, knowing that the balance between order and chaos is as delicate as a tightrope over a moat. A group of knights lines up for the first choreographed march. Their boots scuff the grass in perfect rhythm, polished armor catching the lantern light and throwing it back as small flashes of gold and silver. You notice a detail that makes you smile. One knight has attached a tiny bell to his helmet for dramatic effect. "It jingles," he says proudly. "Like battle music. It's pure Edwardian whimsy, this blending of spectacle with a nod toward history." Historians still argue whether medieval parades truly embraced pageantry in this exaggerated way, or whether the Edwardians simply invented a more theatrical past for themselves. Behind them, noble ladies glide in pairs, carrying baskets of flowers, their skirts brushing the dew-dampened grass. The hems are weighted with hidden beads to make the fabric move with deliberate grace. You step closer, noticing how the evening breeze catches the threads, turning embroidery into ripples of dancing light. A small child, cast as a page, scurries past, holding a scroll that flutters like a bird in his tiny hands. He trips, righting himself with a flourish, and the moment passes unnoticed by all but you. That's the magic of these pageants. Accidents are seamlessly woven into spectacle. A minstrel perched on a small platform plucks the strings of a harp and strums a lute simultaneously. The melody is sweet, lilting, evocative of a time that feels both ancient and imagined. You realize that the music alone can conjure the medieval world more effectively than any costume or prop. The trumpet fanfare joins in sporadically, sometimes out of sync, and yet somehow, the imperfections enhance the charm. You glance around and notice the faintest of smirks from the pageant master. He understands that history is alive not in perfect reproduction, but in creative approximation. At the edge of the stage, artisans adjust props. A faux dragon's head yawns, painted flames licking the air. A jeweled crown gleams in the lantern light. The mechanical horse creaks and groans under the weight of its rider. You can almost hear the gasps of the evening audience. The Edwardians designed this stage to surprise and delight, to make the mundane feel miraculous. A volunteer whispers, "If you close your eyes, you can almost believe this is real." You try it, and for a heartbeat you do. A small commotion near the tapestry wall draws your attention. The wizard rehearses his incantations, waving a glowing orb that flickers with the hidden candle inside. He mutters a phrase from memory, attempting to make it sound like an authentic medieval spell. You can see the concentration etched across his face, and for a moment he looks like he could truly summon magic. Another performer steps in, correcting a gesture, and the wizard nods gratefully. Edwardians adored these flourishes. The blending of theater, illusion, and historical fantasy created a kind of collective enchantment that was deeply satisfying for both participants and spectators. Nearby, a knight practices a duel with a partner. The wooden swords clash with a satisfying thunk, echoing off the walls of the estate and across the lawn. One swings too wildly, sending the other stumbling into a crate of props. The baronet frowns briefly, but the pageant master swoops in with encouragement. In life, as in pageantry, mistakes are opportunities. You note the subtle philosophy behind all of this. Edwardians saw history not as rigid fact, but as a playground for imagination, morality, and storytelling. The final sequence begins to form. Knights, noble ladies, pages, musicians, and artisans all moving in deliberate choreography. The banners ripple, the armor glints, the props gleam, and the lantern light softens into a golden wash over the ensemble. The Edwardians' obsession with detail becomes clear. Every gesture, every glance, every decorative flourish is intentional. And yet there's room for improvisation, humor, and humanity to breathe. It is this delicate balance that makes the pageant feel alive, even centuries after the historical period it recreates. You step back, letting the tableau settle around you. The air is cool, filled with the faint scent of candle smoke and polished wood, and the grounds are alive with movement, sound, and light. This is Edwardian pageantry at its most mesmerizing. A staged medieval world, imperfect yet intoxicating, rooted in imagination, artistry, and devotion. And as you stand there, you understand that the essence of it, its charm, its drama, its magic, lies not in reproducing history exactly, but in creating a shared dream where history and fantasy entwine seamlessly. The night deepens, and you drift closer to the pageant's behind-the-scenes corridors, where the air hums with anticipation, and the faint scent of wax and oil lamps lingers like a promise. Here, costumes hang on racks like suspended history, rich velvets, shimmering silks, and embroidered tunics that capture the imagination as much as they reflect Edwardian ideals of medieval grandeur. You notice a subtle detail. The hems of some gowns are deliberately frayed, giving them an air of age, though closer inspection reveals meticulous modern stitching beneath. It's a clever illusion, a visual whisper that convinces the eye while bending historical truth just enough to suit the aesthetic. A page scurries past, holding a folded scroll high above his head. You peek over his shoulder and see lines of dialogue you recognize from the master's quill, though a few have been lightly revised. Some verses shortened, some gestures exaggerated. The Edwardians clearly favored spectacle over rigid accuracy, yet you can't help but admire the meticulous care devoted to these adjustments. One could almost say that in these minute revisions lies the heartbeat of their pageantry, humanity animated by imagination. Historians still argue whether these performances were intended primarily as entertainment or as moral instruction, but you sense it is both, seamlessly intertwined. Near the edge of the rehearsal area, a group of performers practices a ritualistic crowning sequence. The faux king kneels on a raised platform while a noble lady, her hair braided with tiny gilded ribbons, places a delicate crown upon his head. You notice the careful choreography, the tilt of his chin, the sweep of her arms, the precise angle of the crown, each movement measured to ensure the audience experiences the full grandeur of medieval symbolism. A whisper reaches your ear. Remember the sparkle on the jewels. It's all about light and illusion. You smile, thinking of the Edwardians' subtle obsession with theatrical optics. In another corner, a small ensemble of musicians tunes their instruments. A harp, a lute, and a pair of wooden flutes catch your attention. The melodies are intentionally archaic, evoking the distant echoes of a medieval court, yet you detect faint modern flourishes, a playful Edwardian touch that adds brightness without breaking the spell. One musician hums a folk tune under his breath, improvising subtly, reminding you that pageantry is a living art, shaped in real time by those who inhabit it. A pair of knights rehearses a choreographed duel nearby. Their wooden swords clang rhythmically, sparks of motion reflected in polished helmets. One knight, in a moment of improvisation, spins too far and knocks over a small prop cannon. There's a brief, tense silence, and then laughter erupts, warm and unforced. The pageant master swoops in, quill in hand, jotting down notes for adjustments. Leave room for chaos, it's part of the drama. You think about how this ethos, structured yet flexible, mirrors the Edwardian desire to reconcile historical reverence with theatrical delight. As the rehearsal continues, you observe the clever integration of props and scenery. A painted dragon head, its jaws hinged and painted with meticulous care, looms near the main stage. When a performer swings it, it opens its mouth with a hiss, creating a startling yet playful illusion. Nearby, banners sway gently in the evening breeze, their bold colors and heraldic designs casting long shadows over the lawn. You catch yourself imagining how an audience of Edwardians, conditioned by a longing for the romantic past, would gasp in collective delight. You wander closer to a tapestry that dominates the center of the grounds. Its scenes depict knights rescuing maidens, villagers bowing before kings, and dragons vanquished in heroic flair. You note a subtle anachronism. One knight carries a sword with a crossguard far more decorative than medieval practice would allow. A young volunteer notices your glance and whispers, "It's Edwardian flair. They love dramatics." You nod. It's true. The pageant isn't merely a reenactment but an interpretation, a vivid, living lens through which the Edwardians viewed the past. The performers fall into line for a full dress rehearsal of the final tableau. Knights raise swords, noble ladies bow gracefully, pages scuttle with scrolls, and musicians fill the night with a harmonized chorus of strings and wind. Lanterns cast warm pools of light, illuminating every glint of metal, every shimmer of silk, every carefully arranged flourish of costume and gesture. You realize that all these orchestrated elements, costumes, props, choreography, music, and subtle improvisation, combine to form something bigger than the sum of its parts. A shared dream of medieval splendor, created centuries after the fact but alive in its intent. And as you step back to watch, you feel the magic settle around you, tangible and gentle, like the last note of a song hanging in the air. In this Edwardian vision of history, every detail, every exaggeration, every improvisation works in harmony, inviting you not just to observe but to believe. For just a moment, the distant past feels immediate, accessible, and wonderfully real. You wander toward the far end of the grounds, where the evening shadows grow long and the lanterns' glow softens into pools of golden light. Here, the focus shifts from grand spectacle to the subtler, almost imperceptible elements that make the pageant feel lived in. A cluster of volunteers tends to props that won't be center stage, but whose presence adds layers of authenticity. Baskets of faux fruit, pitchers of hand-painted pewter, and tiny chests brimming with glittering imitation coins. Even in these small details, you see the Edwardian obsession with creating a fully realized world, one that immerses spectators in the narrative without a single word being spoken. Nearby, a group of performers rehearses a marketplace scene. The peasants haggle with exaggerated gestures, while the merchants offer wares with mock solemnity. You notice a young actor slip a toy squirrel into his basket, a nod to the improvisational humor the pageant master encouraged. Someone whispers. It distracts the king in scene 3, and you recall the scribbled note in the scripts. The anachronism is deliberate, playful, and quintessentially Edwardian. Historians still argue whether such comedic elements were historically accurate or merely inventions of nostalgic imagination. But here, you see the charm of it. The line between education and entertainment is delightfully blurred. You drift past a small group practicing sword choreography. Their wooden swords clash in rhythmic harmony, echoing softly across the estate. One knight over-enthusiastically swings and nearly topples a nearby lantern, eliciting a chorus of laughter. The pageant master, ever vigilant, scribbles a note, muttering something about timing and spectacle. You can't help but admire the balance he maintains, structured rehearsal paired with room for human error. It's a philosophy that allows both authenticity and improvisation to coexist seamlessly. A musician tunes her harp while simultaneously adjusting a tiny drum beside her. She hums a melody that feels both ancient and whimsical. The Edwardians were obsessed with auditory illusions, music that suggested a medieval soundscape, even if the instruments themselves were slightly modernized. You notice the subtle layering of tones, the echo of the strings against painted walls, the rhythm of footsteps on grass. Every sound contributes to the spell, pulling the audience into a past that never fully existed yet feels undeniably vivid. Off to the side, a craftsman polishes a suit of armor, his motions slow and meditative. The metal gleams, catching lantern light like liquid silver. You lift a helmet to inspect it, surprisingly light but convincing enough to satisfy both performers and audience. He explains that real medieval armor could weigh over 50 pounds, making prolonged performances nearly impossible. The Edwardians understood this, balancing spectacle with practical considerations, a blend of romantic imagination and pragmatic adaptation. Near the central stage, a tapestry depicts a heroic rescue, knights saving a maiden from a dragon's lair. You lean closer and notice a small detail. One knight's lance is slightly too long, another's helm is historically inaccurate, and the dragon sports a mischievous grin. Yet the tableau works perfectly. The minor errors are absorbed into the larger narrative, enhancing rather than detracting from the illusion. Edwardians were masters of this delicate sleight of hand, manipulating perception, so that audiences believed in the grandeur of the medieval world, even as the modern era peeked through. The performers begin moving into a full-dress rehearsal, weaving together the marketplace, swordplay, musical accompaniment, and tapestry tableaus. You step back and watch the choreography unfold. Knights clash, pages dash, noble ladies bow, and musicians fill the night with sound that feels like history itself. The Edwardians' meticulous attention to detail, combined with imaginative flourishes, creates a spectacle that is immersive, entertaining, and subtly educational all at once. You pause and take a deep breath. The air is cool, scented faintly with candle wax and polished wood, alive with anticipation and the promise of performance. For a moment, it feels as though you are suspended between centuries, watching history imagined, reimagined, and brought vividly to life. And in that space, you understand the true magic of Edwardian pageantry, the careful blending of fact, fiction, and human creativity into a shared dream that captivates both participants and spectators alike. A young harpist plucks the strings lightly, experimenting with a melody that feels both archaic and playful. Beside her, a flutist adjusts the tone of a wooden instrument, glancing at sheet music that is a curious mix of medieval notation and Edwardian improvisation. You notice how they pause occasionally, listening to each other, fine-tuning not just notes, but the very mood of the performance. Edwardians understood that pageantry was more than visual spectacle. It was an immersive sensory experience, a careful layering of sight, sound, and subtle theatrics. Historians still argue whether music in authentic medieval pageantry was as formally structured as these Edwardian interpretations, but here it works beautifully. Nearby, a group of performers rehearses the opening tableau. Knights in polished armor line up, their wooden swords poised. Pages dash back and forth with messages in hand. Noble ladies glide gracefully across the lawn, their skirts swishing with exaggerated elegance. You watch as one young page trips over a banner cord, recovering with a quick flourish. The pageant master jots a note in the margin of his ever-present folio. Embrace the chaos. It adds charm. You realize that imperfection is not just tolerated, it is woven into the magic of the spectacle. Off to the side, a craftsman polishes the dragon prop, adjusting its hinged jaws and painted eyes so that it looks convincingly fearsome. The wizard rehearses a spell sequence, his glowing orb flickering in the lantern light. He waves his hands with exaggerated gestures, casting an imaginary spell that to the audience will feel like genuine enchantment. The Edwardians loved these touches, blending illusion, theatricality, and historical fantasy into something enchanting and entirely their own. You notice subtle interactions between performers that reveal the human side of the spectacle. A knight steadies a page who is nervous about a sword routine. A noble lady whispers encouragement to another struggling with a difficult curtsy. A musician offers tips on rhythm to a harpist. These small gestures remind you that pageantry was as much about community and collaboration as it was about historical representation. Edwardians found joy not only in recreating a romanticized past, but in sharing that process with each other. As the rehearsal progresses, the pageant master moves among the performers like a conductor guiding an orchestra. His instructions are precise, yet delivered with humor and encouragement. More gravitas here, he calls, or don't forget the sparkle on your gloves. His quill flies across scraps of paper, jotting down notes that will refine the performance, adjust timing, and ensure that the illusion remains seamless. You can almost see the Edwardian philosophy taking shape. History is a canvas, and imagination is the brush. At the heart of it all, the full ensemble begins to move through a complex sequence. Knights clash swords with exaggerated flair, pages scuttle with scrolls, noble ladies curtsy or recoil gracefully, and musicians provide an accompanying soundtrack that threads everything together. Lantern light glints off polished armor, banners ripple in the breeze, and painted props catch the eye with strategic illumination. The choreography feels fluid, organic, and alive, less a rigid historical reenactment than a breathing, vibrant reimagining of a medieval world filtered through Edwardian eyes. Standing back, you notice how every detail, no matter how small, contributes to the overall enchantment. A minor misstep, a playful improvisation, even a deliberately anachronistic flourish all become part of the tapestry of illusion. Edwardian pageantry, you realize, thrives on this delicate balance. The collision of accuracy and invention, the interplay of fact and fantasy, the careful curation of spectacle and spontaneity. It is a shared dream, a temporary kingdom brought to life by the imagination and dedication of its makers. You pause and take a deep breath, letting the evening air fill your lungs. The faint scent of wax, wood, and fabric mingles with the distant strains of harp and flute. You glance across the rehearsal grounds, knights poised, pages moving, noble ladies glowing in lantern light, props perfectly staged, and the pageant master scribbling notes furiously. For a brief, magical moment, you are suspended between centuries, part of the Edwardians, imaginative recreation of a past that never truly existed, but feels vividly alive right now. The evening air grows cooler as you wander toward the far edge of the estate, where the shadows deepen and the flickering lanterns lend everything a soft, almost ethereal glow. Here, the finer details of the pageant come into focus, props meticulously arranged for dramatic effect, subtle lighting cues, and performers rehearsing small gestures that will go unnoticed by most spectators, but matter profoundly to the overall illusion. You notice a young page carefully adjusting a basket of faux apples, the ripples of his tunic catching lantern light in a way that makes the mundane seem magical. A knight practices a solo flourish with a wooden sword, the rhythmic clang echoing faintly across the lawn. Each movement is exaggerated for theatrical visibility, yet grounded in an understanding of historical combat gestures. You notice the effort it takes to balance spectacle with authenticity. A nearby craftsman polishes a small shield, tracing painted motifs with delicate precision. The result is dazzling, almost hypnotic under the lantern glow. Edwardians were obsessed with these little flourishes, texture, shimmer, light. They understood that historical immersion required not just grand visuals, but carefully curated sensory details. Historians still argue whether medieval audiences experienced such aesthetic precision, but the Edwardians certainly did. The wizard rehearses quietly nearby, waving his glowing orb and chanting incantations under his breath. The orb flickers, casting shifting shadows across the nearby tapestries, making the painted dragons and knights appear almost alive. You catch a fleeting moment where the wizard glances at you with a conspiratorial grin, as if acknowledging the shared magic of imagination between performers and observers. Even the most obviously artificial elements, wooden props, painted banners, lantern-lit orbs, become convincingly real in this carefully orchestrated environment. A small ensemble of musicians tunes a harp, a lute, and a pair of flutes. One harp string snaps, eliciting a startled yelp followed by laughter from the performers nearby. The flutist improvises lightly to cover the sound, and the music continues seamlessly. It strikes you how much Edwardian pageantry depended on adaptability and improvisation. Despite meticulous planning, the performance had to remain fluid, flexible, and responsive to unforeseen moments. You realize that part of the charm lies in this gentle unpredictability. It makes the spectacle alive, breathing, and human. Off to the side, a noble lady practices a delicate curtsy while holding a candle. The hem of her gown brushes against the grass, weighted with tiny beads to ensure graceful movement. You notice a subtle detail. One bead has come loose and clinks softly against the metal of her ankle bracelet. She doesn't stop. She simply incorporates the small imperfection into her rhythm, a tiny demonstration of the Edwardian philosophy. Embrace minor flaws, and they become part of the performance. You wander past a stack of painted banners, each depicting heraldic symbols and knights' crests. The colors are vivid, the brushstrokes carefully layered to create texture and depth. One banner features a unicorn holding a shield, a fantastical addition that would never have appeared in a real medieval tournament. Yet it perfectly captures the Edwardian approach. History is not merely reproduced, it is interpreted, embellished, and made visually compelling. As the performers move into the final sequence of rehearsal, the choreography unfolds like a living tapestry. Knights raise swords in unison, pages dash with scrolls, noble ladies curtsy elegantly, and musicians fill the air with harmonized melodies. Lanterns cast warm glows on armor, fabric, and props, creating a spellbinding tableau. You notice the care in every detail. Even minor gestures, a flick of a wrist, or the timing of a step has been orchestrated to maintain immersion. The illusion is complete, yet it remains delightfully human, charmingly imperfect. Standing back, you feel the culmination of Edwardian pageantry in the full scene before you. Every detail, costumes, props, gestures, music, and light, works in harmony to create a world both imagined and deeply felt. It is a celebration of craftsmanship, imagination, and human creativity, where history and fantasy intertwine seamlessly. You exhale slowly, letting the beauty and complexity of the moment settle around you, realizing that you are witnessing something more than performance. You are witnessing a dream of the past made manifest, a shared vision that bridges centuries with laughter, devotion, and wonder. The estate now shimmers in full evening splendor, lanterns casting long, golden reflections across the dew-fresh grass. You wander toward the central stage, where the ensemble is beginning a full-dress rehearsal of the climactic scenes. Every performer moves with a practiced rhythm, yet there's an underlying tension, an electric anticipation that comes with knowing a live audience will soon arrive. Knights swing wooden swords with dramatic flair, pages dart between them clutching messages and scrolls, and noble ladies bow and curtsy with graceful precision. The choreography feels alive, a living mosaic of Edwardian imagination in motion. A young knight pauses mid-stride, noticing that his surcoat is twisted. A page rushes to adjust it, muttering something about keeping the king dignified. You smile. These tiny interventions, improvised in the moment, are what breathe life into the pageant. Historians still argue whether Edwardian pageants were more about public education or social spectacle, but the care evident in these micro details suggests both. The audience is entertained while subtly absorbing moral, historical, and social cues. Off to one side, the wizard practices his gestures with the glowing orb. The flickering light creates dancing shadows on nearby tapestries, making painted dragons appear poised for flight. He murmurs incantations, mostly invented, yet the cadence feels authentic, ceremonial, and mystical. The effect is immediate. Even observers like you, aware of the artifice, can't help but feel a faint shiver of enchantment. It's the Edwardian mastery of illusion, enough suggestion to stir the imagination, enough craftsmanship to make it convincing. Musicians orchestrate an undercurrent of sound, weaving harp, flute, and lute into a layered melody. One harp string breaks, eliciting a brief pause, but the flutist improvises seamlessly, keeping the music continuous. You notice the subtle adjustments made to ensure the narrative flow remains unbroken, an Edwardian commitment to performance that balances meticulous planning with flexible, human adaptability. Nearby, artisans make last-minute adjustments to props. A dragon's jaw hinges tightened, a crown is aligned to sit perfectly on the king's head, and banners are subtly rearranged for maximum visual impact. You notice a young volunteer polishing a shield while whispering encouragement to a nervous performer. These small, behind-the-scenes acts of care reveal the collaborative nature of pageantry, a blend of craftsmanship, mentorship, and shared devotion to the illusion. The climax begins to take shape as knights raise swords in unison, Banners sway in the breeze, pages dash with messages, and noble ladies perform their bows and curtsies in coordinated elegance. Every gesture, every step, every flourish is timed to the beat of the music and the direction of the master. Lanterns illuminate polished armor, shimmering fabrics and painted props, transforming the stage into a luminous tableau. You realize that in this moment the Edwardians have succeeded in their ultimate goal. The audience, both real and imagined, is transported entirely into a romanticized past. You drift closer to a tapestry depicting a knight slaying a dragon, and you notice the whimsical details. The dragon sports a mischievous grin. The knight's lance is slightly longer than historical accuracy would dictate, and the unicorn in the corner looks remarkably heroic. None of this matters. In fact, it adds to the pageant's charm. The Edwardians understood that historical fidelity was secondary to creating a narrative and visual experience that felt alive, immersive, and emotionally resonant. As the scene reaches its crescendo, the ensemble freezes in a perfectly staged tableau. Knights poised, noble ladies serene, pages attentive, musicians ready for the final chord. The lantern light glimmers across every surface, and for a heartbeat, time feels suspended. In this Edwardian world, history, fantasy, and imagination converge seamlessly. You step back, taking in the scene, realizing that you are not just an observer. You are part of a living dream, a shared journey through a past that never quite existed but feels vividly, wonderfully real. The night has settled fully, and a quiet hum of anticipation floats through the estate as performers rehearse the final sequences before the evening performance. You wander among them, feeling the pulse of activity, the subtle choreography of preparation, the whispered instructions, the gentle clatter of wooden swords and armor. Everything is deliberate, yet infused with the playful improvisation that Edwardian pageantry thrives upon. You notice how the lantern light casts warm shadows, accentuating the glint of polished metal, the shimmer of silk, and the vibrant colors of painted banners. A young page darts past, carrying a scroll with lines for the final scene. He trips briefly, recovers, and continues, a small grin on his face. Nearby, a knight practices a ceremonial bow, careful to exaggerate it enough for visibility yet retain an air of dignity. Historians still argue whether such gestures were rooted in actual medieval practice or entirely Edwardian invention, but the effect is mesmerizing. Each movement, intentional or improvised, contributes to a sense of living history, filtered through Edwardian imagination. Off to the side, the wizard adjusts his glowing orb, practicing the final magical gestures. The flickering light throws intricate shadows on the tapestries behind him, making dragons appear to breathe, castles to tower, and forests to sway as if alive. A performer whispers a correction to him. His hand needs to extend slightly more. The motion should suggest casting rather than mere waving, and he nods, incorporating the guidance seamlessly. You marvel at how subtle adjustments, almost imperceptible, dramatically enhance the illusion for an audience unaware of the careful calibration behind the scenes. Musicians gather near the central stage, tuning their instruments with careful precision. The harp strings are adjusted, the flute's notes sharpened, and the lute's chords aligned to create a harmonious foundation for the final scenes. One musician hums a gentle tune under her breath, improvising softly to mask minor timing issues, a testament to the flexible creativity embedded in Edwardian pageantry. You can see the careful layering of sound, movement, and gesture, everything designed to immerse the viewer fully in this staged medieval world. Nearby, artisans make last-minute adjustments to costumes and props. A dragon's jaw hinge is rechecked, banners repositioned for maximum dramatic effect, and armor polished to catch the lantern light perfectly. Even small, seemingly insignificant details, a misaligned glove, a slightly skewed crown, are corrected with patience and care, ensuring the illusion remains intact. You notice a performer quietly smiling at a minor mishap, incorporating it naturally into the choreography. This interplay of precision and spontaneity is at the heart of Edwardian pageantry, history interpreted, imagined, and brought vividly to life. The final tableau begins to form. Knights raise their swords in perfect unison, noble ladies bow gracefully, pages scurry in well-timed rhythm, and musicians fill the air with rich, layered melodies. Lanterns glow warmly, casting a magical ambience across the stage, tapestries, and performers. You observe the meticulous orchestration, every glance, step, and movement choreographed yet alive with energy. The scene is more than a historical reenactment. It is a living, breathing story, a moment in which imagination, devotion, and human creativity converge seamlessly. As the rehearsal winds to a close, you take a step back and absorb the spectacle. The gleaming armor, the shimmering fabrics, the flickering lanterns, the careful choreography, and the subtle improvisations that make the scene feel alive. Edwardian pageantry is not simply performance. It is a shared dream, a communal creation that transports both participants and audience into a romanticized vision of the past. You feel a sense of awe at the craft, dedication, and ingenuity on display, a reminder that even in staged fantasy, history can live, breathe, and enchant. The estate is quiet now, the last hints of twilight fading into a velvety night. You wander along the paths lined with lanterns, listening to the soft murmur of performers as they prepare for the evening's premiere. The air carries a delicate mix of wax, polished wood, and the faint earthy scent of the lawn, mingling with the excitement that hums through every corner of the grounds. Here, amid banners, tapestries, and polished armor, you see the full scope of Edwardian pageantry, a meticulous, imaginative recreation of a medieval world, alive with both beauty and human warmth. Knights rehearse their final gestures, swords clashing lightly in rhythm, their polished surfaces catching the lantern glow. Pages scurry with scrolls, occasionally brushing past a noble lady's skirts, and she adjusts her posture with practiced elegance. Musicians pluck strings and tap rhythms, their melodies weaving through the evening air like invisible threads binding the spectacle together. You notice the smallest details, the glint of a bead on a sleeve, the tilt of a crown, the subtle sway of a banner, all orchestrated to create a seamless illusion. Off to the side, the wizard rehearses with his glowing orb, casting long, dancing shadows that animate the painted dragons and knights on nearby tapestries. He chants softly, improvising gestures, adjusting timing, and integrating every subtle movement into the larger tableau. The care taken in these minor actions underscores the Edwardian philosophy. History is a canvas for imagination, and every gesture, sound, and prop contributes to the audience's immersive experience. Historians still debate the degree to which Edwardians valued historical accuracy over spectacle, yet here it is irrelevant. The magic lies in the perception of authenticity. As the full ensemble begins their final run through, the choreography coalesces into a living mosaic. Knights raise swords, noble ladies bow, pages dart, and musicians play, the combined effect transforming the grounds into a luminous stage. Lantern light glimmers off armor, threads of silk shimmer, banners ripple, and props gleam. The Edwardians' dedication to precision, combined with room for improvisation, ensures that each performance feels alive, unpredictable, and enchanting. You pause to watch a small interaction. A page accidentally collides with a knight, who recovers with a theatrical flourish. The page gives a sheepish smile, the knight a playful nod. Moments like this, unscripted yet seamlessly incorporated, give the pageant its human touch. Edwardian pageantry thrives on this delicate balance of order and chaos, structure and spontaneity. Each participant contributes to a collective dream, where history, fantasy, and imagination intertwine effortlessly. Moving toward the central stage, you see the final tableau forming. The banners ripple, the knight's swords gleam, the noble lady's skirts shimmer, and the musicians' chords swell in perfect harmony. The scene embodies the Edwardian ethos, history filtered through imagination, enlivened with theatricality, and rendered captivating by meticulous attention to detail. The audience, whether present or imagined, is fully immersed in this romanticized medieval world. Finally, you step back and take in the entire scene. The glowing lanterns, the elaborate costumes, the props, the music, and the subtle improvisations that bring the pageant to life. The Edwardians have created more than a performance. They have constructed a shared dream, a temporary kingdom in which past and present, reality and fantasy, coalesce beautifully. Standing there, you feel the quiet joy of having witnessed human creativity at its most playful, dedicated, and imaginative. The night has fully settled now, and the bustling energy of the estate begins to soften into gentle calm. You walk slowly along the lantern-lit paths, feeling the warmth of the glowing lights against the cool evening air, listening to the faint echo of the performers, last adjustments fading into silence. The tapestries sway slightly in the breeze, the banners flutter with a whispered rhythm, and the polished armor glints softly, catching whatever light lingers. The pageant has become a quiet symphony of anticipation, a moment suspended between preparation and performance, where the magic feels almost tangible. You pause and take a deep breath, inhaling the faint scent of waxed wood, fresh grass, and fabric warmed by hands that have labored with care. Each detail you notice, the slight tilt of a crown, the shimmer of a dress, the glint of a sword, reminds you that Edwardian pageantry was more than an act of recreation. It was a labor of love, imagination, and devotion, a shared vision that turned history into theater and theater into a living, breathing world. You can almost hear the ghosts of past performers laughing softly, their footsteps woven into the rhythm of the rehearsed gestures and improvised flourishes that still linger in the air. The estate is quiet now, but the enchantment remains. The lantern light bathes the scene in a gentle glow, shadows dancing slowly across tapestries and banners. You feel a subtle serenity settle around you, a reminder that human creativity can suspend reality, that imagination can build worlds where history and fantasy intertwine, and that even the smallest gestures, an adjusted sword, a recovered stumble, a whispered melody, contribute to something extraordinary. So, as you exhale and allow your senses to absorb the lingering magic, you feel the gentle satisfaction of having witnessed a dream crafted with care, whimsy, and dedication. The Edwardians' vision, imperfect yet perfect, settles softly in your mind, leaving a lasting sense of wonder, warmth, and quiet joy. Sweet dreams.